These three mistakes cost me $500,000 and set me back 7 years. Welcome to the Buy Assets and Work Less podcast. I'm your host, Steve Williams, and on this podcast, we show you how to stop trading your time for money and instead build lasting wealth through property and investing. Today, I'm going to share with you a personal story around the mistakes I made and how I actually set myself back 7 years and it cost me $500,000 in opportunity costs. And I want to share this with you because I want to stop you from making this same mistake. So if you're saved your deposit and you're just about to set out to buy your first property, maybe you're looking to become a rent investor, maybe you've got one property already and you're thinking, I want to expand a portfolio. What am I going to do next? Well, this is a must watch because these three mistakes are something that you could do yourself. And I don't want you to be set back in the same way that I was. So back in the day, I was 24 and I had already had my first property purchase under my belt, and I was a rent investor. I bought something in Canberra while I was living in Melbourne, and it was time to go on and buy property number two. And at the time, I'd saved up a little bit more cash, and I also had some equity or some value in that first property that I could take out to borrow some more money. At the time, I had access to borrowing capacity of about $500,000, and I thought, what's next? And I thought, okay, well, look, I'm living in Melbourne. I know Melbourne, it's a cool place to live. Why not buy an apartment in St. Kilda, right? Well, St. Kilda is a pretty cool place. You've got lots of cafes and restaurants and bars there. How can people not want to live here? And how can an apartment not be in strong demand and grow in price over time? I looked at apartments and they were selling for about $500,000 in the suburb, and I landed on an apartment which was literally like a 5-minute walk to the beach. It was in a smaller block, so not many apartments in that area. There's actually height limits in how high apartment buildings can be. So I thought, okay, well, there's not much supply coming on board. Surely this is a good investment. I put in my offer and the offer was accepted at $525,000. I then moved into the property and I lived there for about a year. At the time, the rental demand was fairly strong and it could have achieved about $430 per week. I then had a situation change with my job, and then I decided to move up to Sydney for a work opportunity. And so I rented that apartment out in about a year's time after I first bought it. I was able to rent it out at $430 per week, and I got a fantastic tenant who ended up staying there for 7 years, and she really looked after the place like it was her own. And I was very grateful for that. When I was living in Sydney, I had this apartment, and given that the income was about $430 per week and the mortgage repayments were about $600 per week, I was forking about $200 per week in mortgage repayments. I also then had on top of that strata fees, which were around $700 per quarter, or call that $2,800 per year. Then I had also some landlord insurance, and I had water rates and council rates and all these other fees that added on top of that. So in effect, I had to fork out about $200 to $350 per week, just depending on where the interest rates are at, because they did fluctuate a little bit during that time. And so I was forking out that amount of money per week holding onto this asset. So that's around $15,000 per year, anywhere from like $12,000 to $18,000 per year to hold this property. And I've held on to that property for about 12 years, right? So I actually had to fork out about $120,000 in the life of holding that property. Over the years, there was times when I thought I would sell it, but I always, had in my gut, maybe the property prices are going to go up in Melbourne. Maybe I should hold on to it. And I decided to keep it. And only just last year, I decided to let go of it because I realized that my money was tied up in that property and it was time to go on and buy something else. I managed to sell the property and I sold it for just $100,000 more than I first bought it for. So in effect, I actually made a loss of around $20,000 based on how much I'd been paying out each year. On top of that, it also had a fee come up, or a levy, to actually replace the windows, which was another $15,000. So in effect, I lost about $35,000 on that property. But it actually gets worse here, because not only did I actually have to fork out this, say, $35,000 over 10 to 12 years, There was also, on top of that, the lost opportunity cost. If I had have taken that money and actually put it into an asset that was actually in a better location, that had better growth prospects, I could have actually made another $500,000. And at the time when I was actually buying this apartment, I was considering buying a house in Canberra. I was originally from Canberra, so I knew Canberra quite well. Back then, you could buy a house for about $500,000. Last year, when I sold the apartment, houses in Canberra were selling for about $1 million. So literally I could have had an increase in value of my net worth by another $500,000. However, at the time, I didn't know this, right? I was 23 going on 24, and I really didn't know much about property. I knew what my parents had taught me. I knew what I read in the media. But back then, there really wasn't much of a thing called a buyer's agent. And the internet had little bits of research and information you could get, but the data really wasn't available back then. So what did I actually learn from this situation? Well, I mean, in hindsight, you really have no idea. So even though I'm saying this, that I lost this money, in hindsight, really it was a big learning opportunity. And this is why I like to actually use that information to educate my clients on what they shouldn't do when they're investing in property, because these little decisions you make, even though you think it's the right thing to do at the time, they can end up being extremely costly. In summary, there's 3 things that I learned from this situation. Number 1 is to be very cautious when buying apartments. Apartments typically don't grow in value, especially in places like Melbourne where there's a real glut of apartments, even apartments that are relatively unique. In Melbourne, there's just a massive oversupply and they're building tons of them, and therefore the prices are remaining quite stagnant. In fact, some prices, if you buy them brand new, they're actually going backwards. Be really careful if you're buying apartments. So that's lesson number 1. Lesson number 2 is thinking that I had to buy in the place that I lived. As I said, I got this loan and I thought, okay, I live in Melbourne. Melbourne's a cool place. Why not buy in Melbourne? But at the time, little did I know that Melbourne, the property market, wasn't really in a state of growth. It was quite stagnant at the time, and it even then went into a decline. I had no idea of this at the time. The agents were telling me that it's a great investment, it's in a great location, it's right near the beach, and I took their word for it, and I bought this apartment. So number 2 is really the fact that you don't need to buy in the place that you live. There's over 15,000 suburbs across the country. You need to look more broadly, work out what actually makes sense, what's going to get you the best bang for your buck, and how can you get the best results. Lesson number 3 is to do your research. The research that I did back when I was 24 was basically catching the tram to St. Kilda and thinking, this is a cool place. But really, I had my head in the sand. I didn't look broadly. I didn't look to the fact that there was over 15,000 suburbs in Australia. Little did I know what property market cycles were occurring at the time, or where the growth prospects actually were. I'll call them hotspots. And if I had have chosen a location that was in a growth cycle, the asset would have grown by another $500,000 potentially, based on what I knew in hindsight. And therefore, I could have extracted that equity or taken that profit out of the property and gone and bought more property in the meantime. And that property really got me stuck for a number of years. And I have to say that when you make a loss on things, you tend to stick it out and want to ride the wave, even though the future for Melbourne apartments isn't really looking that great in the short term. But my ego was saying I didn't want to accept that loss, so I kept holding on to it, and I didn't want to go on and buy another asset. So the learning there as well is that if you do have an asset that's not performing and you know that in the near future nothing's going to really happen, it might be time to take a pause and think, is this the right asset to be holding right now? Or should I consider letting it go if I want to put my money into something that's going to be better performing and serve my portfolio? Well, I hope that these 3 lessons that I personally learned along my journey will inspire and also educate and hopefully stop you from making the same mistakes. Because if I had someone tell me this back in the day, then I know that I could have had potentially another $500,000. I probably would have listened to their advice, right? So just to recap on our lessons for today, number 1 is be careful with apartments because often they don't grow in value to the same extent as houses. They can often be money pits, especially if levy fees come up where you need to do maintenance to the building. Number two is to don't think you just have to buy in the place that you live. Australia is a massive place. I mean, the world's a massive place, let alone Australia, but there's places outside where you live that might actually be a better place to buy at this point in time. Sometimes people think that, oh, the property market is performing softly because they may be listening to local media, which is only really focusing on that market. I mean, at the moment, a lot of Sydney commentators are saying the Australian property market is very soft, which is not true. The Sydney market's a bit soft, but if you look in other places of the country, it's actually quite strong. So think outside the box. You don't have to buy where you live. And then number three is do the research. Make sure you rely on data that's reliable and that's going to give you the best result possible. And that's going to mean that you can potentially get a much better result than if you go flying blind and just buy an asset willy-nilly. Thank you very much for joining us today. We hope this has been helpful. If you want to get all the latest and join our community, remember to subscribe. We have videos coming out weekly. You can also follow us on Instagram. Head to buyassets.com.au. You're also welcome to submit a question there. I'd love to feature that on an upcoming podcast, and also comments below. Any of those questions you ask, I will get back to you. I promise. It's been great having you here today. Until next time, let's buy assets and work less together. All information contained in this podcast is general in nature and does not consider your individual circumstances. You should consider the appropriateness of this information with regards to your individual objectives, financial situation, and needs, and speak to a professional.